Vessels not under command and vessels restricted in their ability to maneuver are treated similarly under the rules as their combined status under Rule 27 reflects. The Rule 3 definition of a vessel not under command is that of a vessel unable to maneuver as required of ordinary vessels because of exceptional circumstances. Rule 3 also defines a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver as one unable to keep out of the way because of the nature of her work. In both cases, the vessels cannot physically comply with the rules for ordinary vessels, and so they are granted special privileges. Rule 18 requires all other vessels to keep out of the way of these two classes of vessels. In Part A, it specifies that a vessel not under command has usually suffered a disability which is not easy to predict or classify. An example would be a vessel with a disabled rudder. The navigational light requirement is therefore brief and general. In Part B of this rule, it specifies that unlike the not under command category, vessel classifications within the restricted inability to maneuver category are predictable and are listed in the Rule 3 definition. Rule number 27, starting with paragraph B, gives general navigation light requirements and then more specific requirements for several vessel activities that restrict maneuverability. If you don't remember Rule number 3 mentions definitions of the vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver. They give a few examples, and those examples include a vessel engaged in laying, servicing, or picking up a navigation mark, submarine cable, or pipeline, a vessel engaged in dredging, surveying, or underwater operations, a vessel engaged in replenishment or transferring persons, provisions, or cargo while underway, a vessel engaged in the launching or recovery of aircraft, a vessel engaged in mine clearance operations, and a vessel engaged in a towing operation, such as severely restricts the towing vessel and her tow in their ability to deviate from the courses. The lights described in paragraph B of this rule are not to be displayed by a vessel engaged in mine clearance, even though the mine clearing vessel is regarded as being restricted in its ability to maneuver. Separate lighting requirements for mine clearance vessels are given in paragraph F of this rule. As is also the case with vessels engaged in fishing, vessels restricted in ability to maneuver are required to display additional lights when making way through the water. Anchor lights, as described in Rule 30, are to be displayed while at anchor, in addition to the lights indicating restricted ability to maneuver, except that vessels restricted in ability to maneuver because of dredging or underwater operations, and when an obstruction exists, do not display Rule number 30 anchor lights when anchored. This is more clear in paragraph D of this rule. Under most circumstances, vessels engaged in towing do not have any privileges over ordinary power-driven vessels. In cases where a towing operation severely restricts the towing vessel and her tow in their ability to deviate from the course, the towing vessel is considered to be restricted in its ability to maneuver and is accorded special status. In such situations, Rule 27C requires the display of both Rule 24 towing lights and Rule 27B restricted in ability to maneuver lights. The latter lights are to be displayed where they can best be seen. They should be at a lower level than the masthead lights if practicable, but they may be higher. See Annex 1, Part 2F. The red, white, red all-round lights do not have to be in a vertical line with the masthead lights and may be off the center line. Only the towing vessel displays the lights for a vessel restricted in ability to maneuver, not the vessel being towed. Paragraphs D, and I will show you paragraph E in the next slide as well, gives further details for vessel restricted in ability to maneuver because they are engaged in dredging or underwater operations, including diving. Paragraph D gives new requirements only for hampered vessels having an obstruction projecting out from one side of the vessel. The obstruction could be a dredging arm or a float or other equipment used to support underwater operations. Vessels displaying the obstruction lights required by this paragraph do not also display Rule 30 anchor lights when anchored, but vessels engaged in dredging and underwater operations when no obstruction exists are required to comply with Rule number 30 for anchor lights when anchored. Paragraph E provides for vessels too small to comply with the requirements of Paragraph D for vessels engaged in diving operations. Paragraph E is clearly aimed at the small vessel conducting diving operations regardless of whether an obstruction on one side of the vessel exists. The Paragraph B requirements of this rule for side lights and stern lights when making way cannot be disregarded for small vessels engaged in diving operations, nor can the Rule 30 requirement to display an anchor light when anchored. Paragraph G of Rule number 27 makes clear the intent, as you will see later on. Paragraph E excuses the display of obstruction lights and shapes and excuses the display of the ball diamond ball shape array if the proper size International Code flag alpha is displayed instead. Flags smaller than 1 meter are not permitted for small vessels, even though shapes of reduced size are permitted on vessels less than 20 meters long. Although a flag that big will seem large to people on a relatively small dive board, a smaller flag would probably go undetected by a larger vessel approaching the area. Vessels engaged in clearing mines, or the old term mine sweeping or mine clearance, display a unique combination of navigation lights to warn others of their dangerous operations. You can see the lights on your screen right now. These lights are carried in addition to the lights carried by an ordinary vessel. That is, if the vessel is more than 50 meters, you can see that this vessel is more than 50 meters in length. It is displaying both masthead lights, and because it is underway or making way, it is also displaying the side lights. Paragraph G exempts small vessels from the light and shape requirements for vessels not under command and restricted in ability to maneuver. Such small vessels presumably could not then claim the status of vessels in such situations and would not be given the privileges accompanying such status unless the small vessel's predicament were recognized by other means. Small vessels engaged in diving operations do not have this blanket exemption but may comply with the alternative requirements of paragraph E of this rule. Finally, the final paragraph in rule number 27 makes clear that even though a vessel not under command, or less likely a vessel restricted in ability to maneuver, may actually be in distress, the lights and shapes required by this rule do not indicate distress and need of assistance. If you do in fact need assistance, use one or more of the signals listed in Annex 4 that describes the distress signals. A vessel may be not under command for any number of reasons, and many of those would not require outside assistance.